So it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Greater Good Gathering 2.0. I'd just like, before we start our panel this morning, I want to thank a couple of people for making this possible. First of all, Eric Schnurr, who really is the originator of the whole idea of the Greater Good Gathering. And we are delighted to be co-sponsors here at Columbia SIPA. We've had a lot of help with this conference from the Academy of Political Science, Bob Shapiro playing two roles. Normally he just plays Woody Allen, but in this context he's doing the president of the Academy of Political Science and a professor at SIPA. The Columbia Law School is also a sponsor. Public Works, Brainstorm Consulting, and the Union Theological Seminary. And we want to thank them all for contributing to this really exciting conference. I also want to thank some of the people who work so hard behind the scenes to make this happen. Kevin and Ashley, who work with us at SIPA, without whom this really wouldn't have happened at all. Lauren, Caroline, and Lacey, who work at the Academy and with Public Works, all of whom really did an extraordinary effort to put these events together. Some of you who have done these kinds of things before know how difficult it is, especially at Columbia University. And I think they've done an extraordinary job. Thank you all. So it's my pleasure to be moderating our first panel of the morning. And I'm Ester Fuchs. I'm a professor here at SIPA and the Department of Political Science. The title of our panel is Consciousness, Technology's Effects on Thought and Thinking. Not exactly a small topic, but as you will see, we've got the right panel to have this discussion. Now, just briefly, we all recognize the pervasiveness of technology in our personal relations, at our jobs, and in our political life. And whether it's family dinners where everyone immediately takes out their smartphones and puts them on the table, and it makes you wonder, do they think that little black thing is more interesting than I am? And at work, when we find ourselves buried in email or start thinking about whether the new technology will actually someday replace us completely, or in political life, as yesterday's panel explained, algorithms are being used to micro-target voters during elections. Judges are using them to decide bail or prison for offenders who are awaiting trial. And of course, in my own field, smart cities are going to solve every urban problem from mass transit to poverty. And of course, I've yet to understand what a smart city really is because, you know, none of us really want to live in stupid cities, do we? So, but most of us actually don't really understand how technology works, especially how it impacts our cognition and thinking. And when you start thinking about it, just you yourself, as a simple human being, actually start thinking about it. How can we really understand whether technology is ruining the quality of our life or it actually will produce a future for us all that we're looking forward to if we don't understand how it affects us in the most fundamental ways? So today, it's fortunate for everyone here that our panel this morning can help us answer some of these critical questions. So I'm going to take a seat and we'll begin our discussion. So we will begin today, and I'm really delighted to be doing this introduction with the perfect person, Jeannette Wing. Jeannette, I'm on, yes. Yes, you wanted everyone to hear that introduction. I think that's right. Jeannette is the Evanescence Director of the Data Science Institute here at Columbia University and a professor of computer science. Before she came here, she was the corporate vice president for Microsoft Research and, of course, has had a distinguished academic career. And we're very fortunate that she came to lead our Data Science Institute. So, as a computer scientist and a data scientist, you've seen the evolution and explosion of the field of artificial intelligence. So I'm going to ask you the simple question of the day. Can you explain to us how AI actually, what it does that may actually impact our human cognition, and why maybe we should be worrying about this?
Thank you, Esther. I am delighted to be here, and I wanted to... Okay. Can you hear me now? Great, wonderful. So I wanted to address this question of evolution and explosion of artificial intelligence and answer the question, what can humans do that computers cannot? What can computers do that humans cannot? And what can they do together that outdo either alone? And I think this will address some of the concerns and the capabilities of artificial intelligence as we know it. But before I answer those questions, I wanted to take a little time to give you a little history of how artificial intelligence has come about, and especially the recent few years of why AI has exploded in terms of its prevalence and its applicability to everything. So I'm not going to go back to the dark ages, if you will. I'm just going to go back to 1956, which is when there was a Dartmouth conference, a conference at Dartmouth, and basically who we call the grandfathers of AI convened. And that was where the term artificial intelligence was first coined by John McCarthy. In fact, the proposal that he and others wrote for holding this summer research institute was to study every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence that can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. In other words, the goal was to build a machine that could essentially simulate intelligence, let's just say human intelligence. But early on, even at this conference, everyone realized that this was too big a problem to solve all at once. So what happened in the field is very early on, the field divided the tasks that humans are good at, like vision and speech and language and mobility and so on and so forth, into separate buckets. And then the scientific community tackled each of these tasks to the point where each of these subtasks that humans are very good at became their own subfields of computer science. So you had computer vision and computer speech and natural language processing and machine translation, and they all became their own complete little communities for decades, until around the late 90s, early 2000s, when a technique called machine learning really came to fore. And the reason that machine learning came to fore then is not because it was a new technique, it's because the compute power was sufficient to actually make those algorithms efficient and practical. And so what happened was you saw the computer vision community using machine learning to do better computer vision. You saw the computer speech recognition community using machine learning to do better speech recognition. You saw the machine translation people using machine learning to do better machine translation. You saw the robotics community using machine learning to do better robotics. And then everyone thought, wow, maybe we can take this common method called machine learning and address the original vision in 1956 of the grandfathers of AI, and maybe we could actually build a machine that puts it all together. And that is caused a huge resurgence of interest in AI. People then, lots of press writing about general AI and all that kind of stuff, which we're very far from being able to do. And that excited the community. But then I think the major breakthrough recently was around 2011 when the technique called neural networks showed how, for the first time, not just with large compute and these algorithms that have been around for a while, but lots and lots of data, could actually do tasks that were as good and eventually better than humans. And so now, technology that, for instance, recognizes faces is as good or better than humans. And the computer program that plays Go is better than humans. And so everyone is scared, oh my God, AI is going to better us in terms of what we can do. So on the one hand, there are certain tasks that are very well defined when the rules of the game are understood and no one breaks those rules and everyone plays by those rules. It's like a game. And yes, you can make this computer program do better than a human. On the other hand, there are still a lot of things that computers are not good at, no matter how much AI you throw at it, because the learning is not there yet. So the canonical example is common sense reasoning. Little kids know how to do common sense reasoning. We don't know how to get a machine to do common sense reasoning. So all of us who are rational and have some common sense, our thought processes are not going to be easily taken over by AI yet. The other thing that we are very good at that is very hard to get machines to do is fine motor manipulation. So picking up this cup and knowing just how much pressure to put, first of all, what grip to use and how much pressure to put on this paper cup versus this plastic bottle, which is heavier. Easy for us. Even little kids can do that. Very difficult to get those robots to do that. We're making progress, and a lot of the progress is made due to feeding lots and lots of data to these algorithms so that the robots can learn over time something that looks like that might have water in it, might weigh so much, it's a plastic, it's not paper. Oh, lots of reasoning going on there. Very quickly can figure out the grasp and not crush the bottle or the paper cup, and use a sufficient grip to actually pick it up. So, but it's something so easy for us, and we still can't do that so easily. So there are some, now, okay, so that gives you an idea of where the capability is today of what machines can do over humans and what humans are still better at. How about when you put the two together? And this is what's very exciting in the computer science and artificial intelligence and data science community. Because when you put the intelligence of machines together with the intelligence of humans, then can we actually do better than either alone? And there's one example that is probably, it's already an old example where this goes to show, and I'm going to give you a more concrete example after this one, but the one example that really impressed the community is, believe it or not, playing chess. And there's a competition in the chess world, and you have to really be a chess fanatic to know this particular competition, where computers and machines together form a team, and they play against other teams of computers and humans. And they show that, and that, of course, these teams also have played against just machines and just humans, and they showed that this combination of humans and machines actually, for this particular competition, the rules are all set, outperform humans alone and machines alone. but you'll really like to know, you really like the answer of, well, what was the secret? And the secret is that in the competition, it's timed, and so you have to make your moves by a certain time. And it turns out that the human's intuition was critical for saying, I don't want to wait for the machine to spit out the answer, we're just going to make this move. Which is a little, it's nice for us humans to know that there's something to human intuition. From a scientist's point of view, it's a puzzle. We don't understand. That's one example. A more concrete example is with big data, a lot of the deep learning algorithms and models are best when they're fed with data that is labeled. And today, who does that labeling? Usually it's still people. Humans are, a Mechanical Turk, crowdsourcing or whatnot. So there's still a lot of human input to making those deep learning models effective in the end. That will change over time. We will automate a lot of this, but right now there's still an important, boring task that humans play in making machine learning models of today effective. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jeannette. See, my build-up was really right on the mark. I think I just learned more in this brief presentation that you made about cognition and computer science than I did from reading several academic articles, which I personally did not really understand. So this is an extraordinary way to start, and then we're going to go into some applications and thinking about this. And our next panelist is Adrian Ward. Adrian is an assistant professor of marketing. That made me nervous when I read that right away, because of course marketing we don't associate with everything positive about how we...
It makes me nervous too.
Oh, good. Okay. He's at the University of Texas at Austin, and he studies technology, cognition, and how we can be better to those around us, which I thought was a very interesting description of your research. So most people don't realize that they have relationships with their smartphone. We know we have smartphones, but this idea of having relationships with technology is something we don't really think about much. We think about relationships with other human beings. And what I learned from looking at your work briefly is that this can affect our knowledge, our beliefs, and even the decisions we make about other people, this idea of relationships with this technology. And this is fascinating research, it really is. And so what I thought would be interesting for us this morning, and it really links to how Jeannette kicked us off here, is if you could explain how these relationships develop, and something simple like, how does it impact us in our day-to-day life in ways, of course, that most of us really don't think about?
I'll try. So I'm a professor of marketing, but I'm a trained research psychologist. I'm a social cognitive psychologist, so I do experiments to try to figure out how technology is affecting us. And a lot of my work is about memory and attention, but in this sort of social context. So I want to start by not talking about that, but by talking about animal behavior. I used to want to be a zoologist, so this is like my dream. But a metaphor that I think is really helpful for thinking about this sort of thing is that of a supernormal stimulus, which is something that did not exist in the environment when an organism was evolving, but now does exist and sort of surpasses anything that was available at that time. So my favorite example of this is of gulls. So gulls have eggs, and they've got to incubate those eggs by sitting on them. And the way they sort of decide which egg to sit on, which one to preferentially pay attention to, is they just pick the biggest egg, which is a pretty good rule because the bigger eggs tend to be more viable. However, if a scientist shows up and paints a football white and puts it next to the gull is going to sit on the football and ignore all of its own eggs, right? This makes sense because there's a biological limit on how big of an egg a gull can produce. So they just need to know bigger is better. They don't need to know what the best thing is or what the right thing is. But the selection pressure can sort of be manipulated when somebody comes in and says, all right, I'm going to give you something bigger than what could ever exist in your world. And goals don't know how to deal with that because they never had to deal with that as they were sort of evolving this rule of bigger is better. So luckily there aren't a lot of sort of trickster scientists running around painting footballs white and putting them, yeah, right? But we are a lot like goals, right? We have the same sort of easy solutions to complex problems. And those solutions evolved in a context where we didn't have a lot of these technologies, right? And so this isn't just about computers or smartphones. People have made the same argument about sugary and fatty foods. The reason that we are very attracted to sugary and fatty foods is they used to be pretty rare in the environment and they're calorie dense, and so if you could get them, you should get as much as you possibly could. But now we can just create those foods and we have an obesity epidemic, right? So if we're thinking about this in the context of computers and technologies and smartphones, one of the things that they're really good at and that we're really bad at has to do with just how much information that they can hold. So one of the most fundamental constraints we have as humans is that we have limited cognitive capacity. We have limited cognitive resources. We can't pay attention to everything in the world. We can't notice everything, and we can't know everything. So starting first with this idea that we can't know everything. Lots of times it would be good to know stuff. We've never been able to know everything, but we've figured out ways to solve these problems. And a very easy way to do that is to store that information externally, whether it's in a book or a notepad, or one source we use a lot is other people. So I don't need to know how to fix a car if my mom's a car expert and I have her phone number, right? And so we've developed what are called these transactive memory networks, where we know who knows things, and that's pretty much just as good as knowing it. But it's only as good as knowing it if they're going to give you that information, right? And so there are natural constraints on that network as well. And also, if you don't know anything, eventually people are going to kind of kick you out of that memory system because you're a free rider. And so there are things that force us to know things as well, right? And so if we think about who we should sort of allow to know things for us on our behalf, well, you want somebody who has access to that information or knows that information, and somebody that's going to give that information to you. And so we sort of distribute information among our social networks. Now, introduce computers and the internet into this same transactive memory system, and it turns out that they surpass any human on these same dimensions, right? They know more than anybody else. It's instantly accessible. They're not going to get mad at you, right? They're not going to go on vacation. You can always get this information, and they don't ask you, like you don't Google something and they're like, all right, but real quick, you tell me something, right? You just get that information. And so more and more what we see is that people will offload the responsibility for information and memory onto the internet, not just at the expense of other people, but at the expense of their own memories, right? And so we no longer have this decision of, well, should I know this myself? Because we have this sense that everything is saved. So I've done research showing this in learning situations where online classes, if you tell people this is on YouTube, they just don't remember it as well, even if you tell them you're going to take the video down, because we have this sense that we can find it if it's online. Nothing ever actually disappears, right? Versus something live, people will actually remember it a little bit better. Even with factual information, we do this financial decision-making information. Once you know that it's being saved, specifically by a computer, you don't remember it, even if we pay you to remember as much as possible. And that's because there's this very basic human constraint that we have, which is we have limited cognitive resources. And so we're trying to do the best that we can with our limited resources in a very demanding world. So that's how we can think of people are worried that we're not remembering things. That's a well-founded worry. The other slice of this that I think is also really interesting is that there's a difference in retrieving information from a computer or a smartphone than from a person. So if I have to go find the right person, I've got to track them down. Maybe they don't know the information. It's a very physical thing. And I might learn something, but I know that I'm not the expert, right? I might become an expert over time, but I can still know that that information came from them. In a lot of my research, we find that when people Google information, they think that they remembered it themselves, and they think that they thought of it themselves. Yes. Yeah, right. And so a lot of this is because the internet's faster than our own internal search processes. If you're asking Google a question, you're kind of asking it to yourself. Before you can realize you don't have that answer, Google gives you the answer, and you say, oh, okay, I actually always knew that. Right? Even beyond that, it's a seamless interface. And so I don't know if anybody remembers Lycos, but for a while, Lycos and Google had almost identical search results, but nobody used Lycos. So I did an experiment where I had people either use sort of a physical card catalog, use Lycos, or use Google. And then I just asked them a bunch of questions. And afterwards, I didn't ask whether or not they thought they knew it already. I asked, did you answer this yourself or did you use an external source? And people who use Google didn't even remember using Google, using an external source at all. When they used Lycos, when they used the external sort of card catalog, they remembered looking it up because that process of looking it up reinforced that this was an external information source. So more and more, we're offloading information to the internet, but thinking that we actually know it ourselves. And so we can think about this at a cognitive level. We can also think about it as a social level. It's not very romantic, but one of the reasons we need people is because they hold information for us, and they allow us to know things, and they allow us to navigate the world. But if we don't need people for those reasons, that's one less reason to have social connection, right? If I have time, one more thing. Okay, cool. Another really fundamental constraint we have is not just on knowledge, but on attention. Right? There's a lot of stuff going on in this room right now, but you're not noticing all of it. Hopefully you're noticing what's happening right here. But attention is selective. You can pay attention to some things and not others. And so a common problem we have is we go into a new environment, we have to figure out what's important. How do we direct our limited attention? And it uses some cognitive resources to do that sort of attention selection process. So one way we can solve this is instead of every time we go into a room having to figure out, yes, no, should I pay attention to this? Yes, no, should I pay attention to this? Things that always tend to be relevant, we automatically attend to. Right? So things like the sound of your own name. There's this thing called the cocktail party effect. If you're in a room, there are a lot of conversations happening. You filter out the things that are not relevant to you pretty automatically. But if somebody on the other side of the room says your name, it pops through that clutter. Right? And so at a very basic cognitive level, you're not intentionally looking out for it. It's finding you because that's relevant information. Similarly, research shows that new mothers, if a baby is crying, they hear that. Research on new fathers is more mixed. But that's something that's important that you should pay attention to. You shouldn't have to decide whether or not you need to pay attention to that. What we're seeing is more and more as we put basically everything important and rewarding and satisfying into one device, which is our smartphones, which you carry around with us everywhere, we automatically pay attention to our phones. And there's even neuroscience research showing that the sound of your ringtone activates the same area in your brain as the sound of your own voice. The sound of your own name, right? So not somebody else's ringtone, but your ringtone. That's the same area as the sound of your name. This is a very self-relevant thing. So we did some research, and we wanted to look at how just having your own smartphone around would affect the amount of cognitive resources you have available for other tasks. So this isn't multitasking. By the way, multitasking is a myth. It's not good for you. Don't do it. This is just having it around in the presence and not using it for the task. And what we found is that the closer people's phones were to them, if they were on the desk in front of them versus in their pocket versus in another room, the less available cognitive capacity they had for other tasks. And that's because your brain is saying, pay attention to this thing. This is your email, and this is cat videos, this is social media, this is your calendar, this is everything. And so overriding that automatic urge, which makes sense, right, in this context of how we're trying to navigate a complicated environment, overriding that urge uses up some of your cognitive resources, leaving less available for the task at hand. So even when you're doing a really good job at not being distracted, you have to realize that you're doing a job to not be distracted. And by carrying around these sort of distracting items with us everywhere we go, we're constantly putting ourselves in this space of attentional tension where we have to override this automatic urge. So a lot of the stuff I do is thinking about how technology is interacting with our own sort of limits and how we're, in some ways producing unexpected outcomes, but from the same sort of cognitive tendencies, cognitive systems that we've been using all along. Yeah, all sitting on white footballs. There you go.
Thank you, Chris. There's so many questions I could now ask both you and Jeannette, but we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to wait till all of our panelists get a chance to speak. And so I want to introduce our next panelist, Chris Bale. Chris is a professor of sociology and public policy and the director of the Polarization Lab at Duke University, where he helped create Duke's interdisciplinary data science program. And so much of what you do is close to things I think about. So I initially tried to ask Chris a really hard question that nobody really has answered yet, and fortunately for him, I sent it to him first. So I've changed it up to be more reasonable, but I might come back to that really hard question. So that's just a little fair warning. So many people who are concerned about social media echo chambers, and we heard a little bit about that last night in the panel moderated by Jim Fallows. Politics has a big problem when it comes to echo chambers, or the tendency for people to create social media networks that only expose them to views or opinions that they already agree with. So this is not just an issue in politics, it's an issue in every aspect of our life. So I know your research is around this area, and I'm hoping that this morning you can explain to us how these echo chambers shape people's political attitudes and their ability to empathize with those who have opposing views, which I think is just a critically important question for us in the United States, in local communities, and of course globally. So go for it.
Thank you. I might begin with something that Jeannette touched on, which is that humans and machines working together have come to improve the way we can classify things. I would argue that's one of the positive developments in AI. The negative developments have to do with in kind of embedding human bias in algorithms. So, sometimes this is called human-in-the-loop dynamics. If we ourselves have some kind of bias in categorizing something, then a machine will reproduce that. And we see this all over the place, from decisions about parole, which increasingly are being made by algorithms, all the way up to how we build our social media networks, which, as Esther mentioned, is my area of research. So it's been well documented now that people tend to follow people on social media sites like Facebook or Twitter who already share their views. This has the effect, as Esther mentioned, of us becoming kind of repeatedly exposed to information that already conforms with our pre-existing views. So the upshot of this, and something that's implicit in a lot of what policymakers, academics, and all sorts of public intellectuals say, is if that we could somehow break our social media echo chambers, if we could step outside them and listen to the other side, that there would be more moderation. We would be able to empathize with each other. We would be able to understand each other more effectively. On the other hand, if you spend any time on Twitter, you'll know that it's not exactly the paragon of the civil sphere that, let's say Rousseau might have been imagining, right? To put it lightly. So there's this other stream of research which has documented so-called backfire effects. So when I'm exposed to something that conflicts with my view, I'm reminded of all the reasons I don't like that view. And in the end, I'm left with more reasons to disagree with that counter-attitudinal message than I might have had I not seen it in the first place, right? So the challenge for many years for social scientists like me has been to try to figure out how to do research on this issue. We can do it in the lab, and there's plenty of good work that can be done in the lab, but lab research has its limits. On the other hand, this brilliant new field that's being called computational social science has identified a way of embedding experiments within social media platforms themselves. Now, some of these are more controversial than others. Everybody here probably knows about Cambridge Analytica and the so-called emotional contagion experiments on Facebook. But when done ethically and with careful human consent, there's a real opportunity to see what happens in the real world, in our case, when we disrupt social media echo chambers. So in the Polarization Lab that I lead at Duke, we recruited about 1,600 Democrats and Republicans who use Twitter regularly, and we paid half of them to follow bots that our team built that retweeted messages from opinion leaders from the other side. So if you're a Republican, for 1 month, you saw 24 messages a day from Democrats, elected officials, journalists, media organizations, advocacy groups, and vice versa for Republicans. They were exposed to Democrats. And during this time, our bot each day, someone mentioned cute cats, I think it was Adrian, retweeted cute cat pictures. And then at the end of each week, we asked people whether they could identify the cute cat picture. So we not only effectively kind of disrupted people's social media echo chambers, but had some sense of who's paying attention, who was able to recognize the cute animal pictures. So what did we find? So going in, we had hoped, as a polarization lab, that we might decrease polarization. We saw in no case a decrease in political polarization. Instead, we saw Democrats become slightly more liberal after following Republican bot for a month, and Republicans becoming substantially more conservative after following a Democratic bot for 1 month, on the order of the change in public opinion over the last 10 years, just through 1 month of exposure. So what does this mean? Well, getting back to the kind of practical upshots of this and how we're interfacing with technology, the Washington Post recently reported that Twitter has been experimenting with exposing its users to opposing views. And Facebook has done this as well. I mean, it's a very logical, solution to try to counteract the tendency of people to kind of reinforce their view, right? So our research suggests that's not going to be a panacea. We're not going to be able to simply shift the algorithm and move the needle. Over time. Have we re-interviewed them? So the question is, did we re-interview them a year later? Well, it hasn't been a year yet, so now you're giving me a great next project. Right, exactly, yeah, always, yeah. We haven't looked at the persistence of it. So some people, when I describe the study, they say, well, you confirmed what I already knew. Twitter is bad for democracy. Facebook is bad for democracy, right? And I don't necessarily disagree in some respects, but I also think it's naive for us to say, well, let's all get off social media. Or at least for some, us older folks, maybe that's reasonable, but anybody under 30, right, as Adrian has so, eloquently just documented, is going to give up their phone, right? So what can we do? We have to tweak and probably not replace. What types of things might work? Well, we're currently pursuing 2 follow-up studies, one which exposes people to moderates from the other side instead of the whole range of views. It could be that there's a curvilinear effect, so if I'm a strong Republican and I'm exposed to a strong Democrat, that has a backfire effect, but if I'm exposed to a moderate Democrat, maybe that has a moderating effect. Second, we can work to correct misperceptions about the other side. So if you ask Democrats, who are Republicans? The answer you typically get is Republicans are older evangelical Christians who are wealthy. And if you ask Republicans who are Democrats, most Republicans will tell you Democrats are younger, minority, and very progressive. Turns out, of course, that the average Democrat is a middle-aged Christian, from the Midwest. The average Republican is a middle-aged Christian from the Midwest, right? So some research shows that just simply correcting these misperceptions can, that's going to change, exactly, exactly. And then lastly, if I could just sneak in one more thing, and this gets back to something that Adrian was hinting on earlier, some of the really interesting work on correcting these backfire effects suggests that if you can make someone think that the opinion was their own, then they're more likely to embrace it. So in an interesting recent study, some scholars told someone, exposed someone to some misinformation, and then asked them about it. And the people who agreed with it, they then 1 week later told them that they had actually disagreed with the misinformation. And if people are led to believe that they themselves judged the information as true or false, then they're much more likely to endorse that kind of rejection. So there's something about being force-fed information, and that's really the environment we inhabit on social media. It's just a constant fire hose of information, right? But if we can give some kind of autonomy to social media users, and so I've been working with Twitter to develop tools to do this, where we can allow people to monitor their exposure to the other side, allow them to monitor when there's disagreement about something they're seeing, and make their own choice about whether to change their mind.
Thank you very much. I have so many questions, and I'm holding off. The research is really fascinating, and but we who are social scientists do know that we're not always that great in disseminating or even interpreting the kinds of research that we do, and I would include scientists in that group as well. So we're actually extremely fortunate today to have with us Judith Shulevitz, who is a New York Times contributing op-ed writer who covers feminism, culture, and science among the small issues we're all dealing with today. She formerly worked at Slate in its early years, which is when I got to meet her, and I really have followed her work ever since. And it's always exciting, interesting, sometimes exasperating, but always smart. What can I say? And my favorite book that she wrote, which you might think on the surface has nothing to do with this conversation, but it actually has a lot to do with this conversation, is called The Sabbath World, Glimpses of a Different Order of Time. So I have a kind of complex question for you, Judith, which I'm sure you're not surprised that I need to ask you, because you're someone who thinks and writes about some of the really most important transformations that we're experiencing in the 21st century. And you understand the upheavals that technology has created in a lot of different spheres. And some of the research that you've done involves affective computing, which for some of us here who didn't exactly know what that was, she explains it as a way of undertaking to program artificial emotional intelligence into machines. And you know, you've written on smart appliances that we look at, you know, we're anthropomorphizing. I mean, it's kind of an extraordinary thing. And I love how you talk about that. Things like empathetic refrigerators. And without stealing your thunder, could you please explain to us what the hell this really means for us personally, in our social relations, and if you want to jump into the politics, please go right ahead.
Well, thank you, Esther. This is on, right? I want to just note something that just happened on this panel and then move into my cultural critic mode by taking as my object of research, you know, the Super Bowl. One of the themes that both Jeannette and Adrian were talking about is, of course, human obsolescence. It was fascinating to me how very slender the hooks that Jeannette hung sort of human pertinence on, fine motor skills and common sense reasoning. You know, you're really sort of pulling it back here. And you were talking about the obsolescence of the human as a form of expertise, right? As other people as a form of expertise. So what I noticed, how many people here watch the Super Bowl? I don't know if there's a big Super Bowl crowd. Okay, bigger than I expected. I personally don't understand football. My family does, so we always watch it, and their conversation goes over my head. I watch the ads. And there was a common theme in the ads. I don't know if you all noticed this, but the common theme is tremendous anxiety about robots taking our jobs, right? But not just taking our jobs. There were several that were about robots taking our jobs, but because I have my smartphone here and I can't help but hold on to it. There were two that really struck me. One was an ad for Michelob beer, and it started with people who were jogging, and then a robot came along and jogged faster than they did. Same with bicycling, same with golfing. But then everybody, all the humans, headed down to the bar, and the robot went to the bar too, but stood outside the window looking in. And the tagline was, "But it can't enjoy hanging out with the gang at a bar with a Michelob, so don't worry, drink up." And then the second one that struck me was for TurboTax, and it featured a sort of uncanny-looking robot child, like a machine, a very robot-y thing with a human face, who said to his creator or father that he wanted to grow up to be an accountant like his dad. And a woman who was there, who wasn't his mother but was being shown this cool, neat new device, said sort of patronizingly, "All TurboTax Live CPAs are human beings with real emotions. I'm sorry, but you're never going to be emotionally complex enough for that job." And the robot child says, "Is that true, Papa?" And the father says, "Yeah." And the robot child says, "I am sad." And the woman said, "See what I mean?" And the father said, "He's still perfecting emotions." So what is affective computing? Affective computing is perfecting emotions for the robot child. And I just have a funny story to tell about affective computing that I can't help telling. It was invented in the late 90s by an MIT engineer named Rosalind Pickard, who at the time was one of the few female engineers at MIT. She became interested in the question of how machines make decisions. And she began reading Antonio Damasio and other sort of psychologists of emotion and sort of soaking in the, at that point, sort of consensus that emotions are intricately and intimately linked to the decision-making process. And so she decided she would try to program emotions into machine learning and machine decision-making, computer decision-making. But being a woman, she didn't want to call it emotional computing because, women and emotions, and MIT, that was going to hurt her. So she called it affective computing, which means nobody understands what it means. So what is affective computing? It is not actually in its infancy, though we think it is. There's a part of it that is really well developed and has commercial applications and is coming soon to a high-end car near you. And that is the part of it that involves detecting emotions, right? You're all familiar with facial recognition. You're possibly somewhat less familiar with the analysis of vocal intonation to detect, to identify people. Now, all these things can also be, and body language, of course, all these things can be used to extract from this information a conclusion about, an individual's emotional state. And this is really sophisticated, and they're really good at it, and it's already being used in a lot of domains. So the commercial application that's a good example is cars. Coming soon to a high-end car near you are cameras and recorders that can sort of observe you and hear you and decide whether or not you're tired or distracted or overwrought and recommend to you that you pull off the road and calm down, pull off the road and get a cup of coffee, and so on and so forth. The next iteration is going to be what are called semi-autonomous or semi-self-driving cars. A great concern in the automobile industry is what's called the handoff. How does the car decide when it's okay to yield the wheel to a human? When does the car decide they'd better take the wheel back from the human? That they will be using this emotion detection technology. And there are lots and lots of applications. As you can imagine, Google and Amazon and and Apple are all trying to imbue their digital assistants with this kind of analytical ability, mostly focused on the voice. So that's the emotion detection side. And the other side is emotion synthesis, right? So, using this information to program computers to robots or computers or personal assistants to simulate or reproduce appropriate emotions, usually in response to what the emotions they detect. That is in its really early, as they say out in Silicon Valley, it's early days for that technology, but it's advancing rapidly. There's a lot of work being done on that at the MIT Media Lab. Google has something called an empathy lab. So this is, this to me is, kind of interesting in the sense that, soon Alexa will be able to figure out what mood you're in, will be able to respond appropriately, and will be able to solidify bonds between you and your device. As we know, we see the football, we sit on it. We see the device, we hear the device, it says something, even vaguely approximate to an emotion or a statement, an emotionally appropriate statement that a human would make, and we respond to it, we over-respond to it. I mean, there's a lot of information about people who confess their emotions to their Alexa, even though Alexa will then say, oh, you'd like to watch a video of blah, 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 completely misinterpreting it. But people say, I'm lonely, I'm depressed, I want to commit suicide. There's a lot of that. Alexa, will you marry me? And this is for a device that is just really deeply stupid. Right. And once they start to become less stupid, that's going to happen more and more. So they'll solidify bonds, they'll be able to solidify the human-computer bond, and that will give them a great deal of power of persuasion over and influence over our behavior. And it's not just your Alexa or your Google Home, or Google Assistant. It's in the Internet of Things. Your smart refrigerator, your smart toilet. I mean, these are things that are going to be talking to you and are going to be programmed to detect your emotions and one day be able to respond appropriately. Now, what does this mean for human obsolescence? I was fascinated to discover that at an Affective Computing conference held only a few weeks ago, there was a session called Upskilling the Human Workforce Through Affective Computing. And what they were talking about is the argument being made was manufacturing is such a small sector now of our economy, and service is such a growing sector of our economy. What we can use effectively sophisticated robots and computers to do is train humans to be better at their service jobs, to train their emotions, to overcome their sort of empathetic, their inability to be empathetic or place themselves in the minds of their customers. And never mentioned in this discussion was the fact that if robots and computers are good enough to train humans, I don't know what the humans are there for. Why bother? Why not just? So there's already, for example, there's already therapy being done with these devices, mostly where they're avatars for humans. They're being controlled behind, as they say, behind the curtain. But soon you will be having therapy with a robot, and possibly a screen robot, an artificially intelligent entity on a screen. But I think it does go back to the point of human obsolescence. The Super Bowl ads wanted to tell you, we have emotions, they don't worry. And I'm here to tell you, worry.
Thank you so much. I want to go one more round with everybody and give them a chance to really comment on each other's presentations, and then we'll open it up briefly for questions. Since we started a little late, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and end a little after 9. But the set of presentations today are, I wanted to say they're heartening, but mostly they're not. I was hoping for a little more optimism here about the relationships that are being developed between technology and humans and the future it might present for us. And I'm wondering if everybody can take a shot at the question of, can we turn this clock back in any way? I have 2 parts to the question. If you want to really answer that, should we be thinking about turning this clock back in some way? And if you think we can't, clearly there is a role somewhere in this morass for humans. I mean, even the example of the courts that you gave, which I'm familiar with, somebody's programming, right, and deciding what the algorithm is. So if we dig deep back enough into the process, at least with AI, as far as I understand it, there is a human component to that. And, to what extent are we not talking about that and not recognizing that and not bringing that directly into our values discussion about what we want to see our society and our polity to look like, in this, 21st century technological world that we're creating. So why don't I start in the middle, and I'll start with Chris, and then we'll work our way around again, and we'll end with Jeannette.
Sure. I think the answer to the question really hinges on how much bad are we willing to accept alongside the good. So in the case of parole decisions, for example, there's wonderful work by the computer scientist John Kleinberg and the economist Sendhil Mullainathan, which shows that when we use algorithms to make parole decisions, we actually let people who are going to do well outside of jail out earlier. Everybody gets out earlier. The problem comes in when we look at the differential racial outcomes, right? So we're actually reducing the number of African American men who are incarcerated, but we're doing that at a rate that's slower than their Caucasian counterparts, right? So this is one of these utilitarian puzzles that I think is going to come. A computer can optimize for that, but as long as race is part of that calculation, that's always going to be a problem. Another example, equally vexing, is healthcare. So if we look at the delivery of healthcare, if we use machine learning to optimize decision making, or say testing for cancers, some of the latest research shows that we can actually make huge gains for lower income people, but those come at the expense of upper income people who will be monitored less than they are right now, right? So these types of trade-offs, I think, are in our future. And the question is going to be, are the people who stand to gain willing to give up their privilege?
But also, are we going to pretend to delegate those decisions to computers and not take responsibility as a society for the values that are being, represented in these decisions? And that's not a question. That's just a comment. So I'm going to let Adrian. It is a question, I know. I'm sorry. But I'm going to let Adrian continue because I'm just in the light of time.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
I really think that when I think too hard about this, it comes down to what is the point of being alive and being a human, right? So if we are, disposed to offload all of these tasks that we kind of have to do to navigate the world that we don't have to do anymore, the research shows that we're not going to do it, right? So you could ask, well, what's the point of knowing anything? Is there a point? I don't know. What is the point of having control over your attention? The reason we pay attention to things is because at some level they're rewarding, although people talk a lot about dopamine and say it's a reward thing. It's really motivation. But if you think of the business model of the major tech companies, it's all about capturing your attention because that is how they prove their value. Some are not financially valuable yet, and that's how they prove that they one day could be, because they can sell you ads, right? So is that really what we want to do with our most limited resource, which is attention and is time? And so you can say, is that valuable? But then you get to the question of what is valuable. And you could make an argument that if people are perfectly happy to look at screens for the rest of their lives and they're not dying and they're not hurting anybody else, then maybe that's fine. I don't know that I want to make that argument, right? But I think it really does come to the question of what is the point of our time and our attention? And do we want to have control over it, and how do we want to spend it? Was that uplifting?
No, that didn't help me at all. But I'm a values person, so I would mix it up with you a little bit. But I'm going to move it to Judith and let her mix it up with you.
So I have sort of two answers to your question. One is I want to talk a little bit about the good that effective computing, or at least emotion detection, can do in the world. And then I want to talk about my theory of how we can bring values into it. So something I didn't talk about is I just wrote an essay for The Atlantic on voice and how voice affects us. And I said the robot revolution is here. It's just happening in voices. They're not, the embodied robots are a decade away or so, but we're surrounded by voices, and voices affect us differently. Anyway, so one of the things I learned in the course of this research is that there are amazing medical applications to voice analysis through, voice analysis. There's a guy named Yuval Moore in Israel who has perfected techniques of analyzing voice to detect incipient Parkinson's, incipient cardiovascular disease, diabetes. I don't understand how this works because I am not, in fact, a computer scientist, but it's starting to have applications. Another one is in the doctor's visit. There's a company that's focusing on applications for doctors and hospitals. There is a program that exists in the cloud that can analyze the interaction between doctor and patient, recognize some emotional content and possibly dangers of things like over-anxiety, hyper-anxiety, and depression, and sort of signal the doctor during the course of the visit that maybe some questions should be asked about depression or something like that. So that's a little invasive and creepy, but it is. Also, Roz Picard at MIT is doing all kinds of work on using this kind of facial and voice analysis to help autistic people respond in a socially appropriate way and expand the circle the social circles in which they can move and function. So, I don't want to make it all to be glum. Of course, all of this does raise the specter of, the obsolescence of medical professionals, but that's a whole other thing. But how do we bring values back into this equation? And, you're a political scientist, and I have just one word: regulation, right? All of this has to be regulated. We have a completely stunted regulatory apparatus, if it exists at all, for these things, and we're going to have, I think it's going to have to be a regulation revolution before we can live with artificial intelligence in a way that maintains human dignity, right? Because one of the most terrifying implications of effective computing is, imagine how good China is at facial recognition. We've all read about that. Now imagine that they can use that analyze the faces they can recognize and detect emotions. They can detect intentions, or put, emotions that they can algorithmically link to possible intentions. That is a terrifying invasion of privacy. That is something we could, however, regulate, theoretically. I mean, I haven't seen it going on much, but you're the political scientist. Maybe you can tell me how far we could get with that.
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment before we get to Jeannette, because I think this is a critical piece for another panel, really, which is the role of government and the public sector. You brought it in, of course, to a certain extent, in dealing with these transformations that are happening in science and that are being monetized through business ventures with very, very little accountability to a broader public body, which historically we've called government. So the more government weakens, the more it declines, the more it has no capacity to understand the conversation we've had today or to interject the values that society agrees upon, the less this is going to be a force for the good, frankly. So I agree with what you're saying, and I didn't really want to, say that you're wrong. You're not wrong. You're obviously right about the need to think about purpose and meaning in the context of all of this, and we can do it personally or we can do it as a society, and those could produce very different outcomes for us. So I'm going to let Jeannette have the last word on this set of questions.
When Adrian was talking, I was thinking, you said, what is the meaning? I was thinking even deeper, more philosophically, what is the purpose of humankind? What is our role in the universe? Because if you talk about human obsolescence, and by the way, Judith is absolutely right. The progress, if you will, we've made in effective computing is tremendous, and these kinds of emotional bots are already here. If you think about chat bots that have been proliferating around, and we're going to see more of them. First of all, I want to say that as a technologist and a computer scientist, data scientist, I always am optimistic about using technology for good and making sure that we take responsibility for what it is we invent, and ensure that try to ensure that the uses of the technology are for good. And I think we have tremendous capability with AI and data science and so on for healthcare, energy, climate, all these societal grand challenges, social justice. There's potential for us with this technology to actually do better. We just have to make the right decisions, if you will. And I think what's happening right now is that because this technology is in our face as just lay people, and because there's a lot of media attention to this technology and the goods and the bads, now is the time to have this conversation. And also at the same time, we have the rise of China, our own political situation right now, and finally, I do believe IT companies waking up and saying, we actually should take a step back and think about perhaps regulating face recognition technology is a good idea. Well, what would that look like? So I think it's a great thing that the conversation is now in the public. The people who have to be in the room up for this conversation, it's happening. And I don't know what the answer is going to look like, but it's not going to be solved with technology alone or policy alone, government alone, industry alone, or academia alone. It's got to be the mix of the conversation. And I'm just being an optimist. I just think that society, individually and societally, will make progress. I don't think there's an answer, a solution, but I think we all want to survive, and so for the purpose of survival, we'll figure out something that will make progress in this complicated situation. And I think, Esther, you asked a really good question, which is how do we bring our value system into the technology and use of the technology? And I think that the challenge there is that many cultures and societies have different value systems, but technology itself, is kind of, everyone has this kind of smartphone that has this capability. So do we have smartphones that project different value systems? Is that where we're going? I don't know.
Thank you. What I would like to do quickly is take a couple of questions from the audience, because this is too exciting and interesting to not let you participate. And then I'm just going to ask our panel to respond to what parts of the questions they are interested in responding to. So we can do a set of bullet questions. I see 1, 2, 3. Just wait for the mic 1 sec.
Hello. Enjoyed what all of you
And please
had to
identify
say.
yourself. Sorry.
My name is Jack.
That was big help.
I was recently at a China Institute event with Kai-Fu Lee and a man by the name of McAfee. Kai-Fu Lee was the former CEO of Google China and leads one of the main investment firms in both China and the United States in regards to AI, investment in AI. And he recently came out with a book about AI. And I asked a question about some of the pitfalls of AI and, along the lines of what Elon Musk sometimes talks about. And in so many ways, I'm quite fearful of AI, but also there's another professor of AI and biology at MIT who I think is an example of how AI could really benefit the intellectual and scientific health communities and humanity. Her name is Stephanie Senath, and she started off in biology and later became very interested in computer science and AI. And what she does is she figures out ways to have AI aggregate research and look at thousands of individual research projects.
Okay, we need the question.
And basically she takes them and puts them all together and has figured out quite a lot about how the human body works, the effects of Roundup, things like autism. And I think more research should be aggregated by AI. And AI, what you said about the individual human being very important, I think AI, one of the main things that AI can really do is kind of take the individual importance and congregate it and make it even far more useful.
Okay, thank you. The next question. Question has a question mark at the end of question.
Quick question regarding how to not feel judged by our robot servants. For example, there's a person driving in a car. The car says, "Hey, sir, it looks like you're getting really angry." How, if me telling a person that who's driving, the person engages in an anger response. I work as a mediator. Usually when people are angry, they don't admit that they're angry. Calm down is the worst thing you can say to someone, and they're going to blame me that I'm too sensitive. Knowing that my robot car is not sensitive, how are we as a species able to deal with being told that we're angry without having this backlash? Or do you think this is going to be a revolution in coming to terms with our own emotions?
Well, this is
Okay,
actually...
wait. I want one more question, and then we're all going to just take a shot, everybody here, at whatever parts of the questions. There was one more question right there next to you.
Hi, Justin Lee, CEO of Casebook PBC. We actually use AI for improvements in human services, so I'm in the pro-AI camp. Let's be clear on my bias. But one of the questions that I have is based on something that Chris brought up, which is that based on the same experiments, they saw different behaviors based on the political leanings of individuals, i.e. Republicans moving more, confirming their bias more than the other side. How is that then being used by politicians to drive policy making, i.e. is there a context component to this that is actually driving the use of AI to either manipulate particular populations or to actually improve policy?
Thank you. So what I'm going to do is just ask our panelists, starting with Jeannette and ending with Judith, just take a shot at any aspect of these three questions or anything else they want to add.
Okay, well, I'll take the question. I'll take the question about how do we prevent the angry driver from getting even angrier once the intervention has been made. And in the interest of time, I summarized kind of crudely. I got a lot of this from a company called Affective, which actually is a spin-off from the Affective Computing Lab at MIT, and they're working with automobile industries. And they're very concerned about the exact question that you asked. So they're experimenting with, for example, rather than if the car detects emotional distress, maybe some calming music will come on. It's not, I made it blunter than it sounds. There's a lot of work being done on making sure that tonally the car is not projecting judgment. So creating these, you've seen this, if you saw Ex Machina, you've seen this, and every science fiction movie that involves a subservient robot, you've seen this. They're highly skilled at sort of managing the emotions of their human interlocutor. And a fascinating finding is that, so there's a lot of work being done now with using artificially intelligent interviewers to do triage in psychiatric situations, right? And one of the findings is that people will actually tell an avatar more that's being used to just go through this set of questions, this list of questions that every sort of triage nurse goes through. They will yield more information about their emotional state to an avatar than to a human because they feel less judged. Now that's just about programming, because you could certainly imagine programming an extremely judgmental computer, and I know a guy at Carnegie Mellon who does that, interrupting and annoying computers who piss people off. I mean, you could do whatever. But I would say commercially, the interest is in creating non-threatening computers. And then at the next level up, when we're talking about semi-autonomous and autonomous cars and the handoff, right, the computer can just shut the car down, right? And that may piss the driver off, but there's nothing they can do about it. But there's definitely this question of managing the emotional response of the human that's being, let's say, manipulated by the robot or the computer. This is a very big topic.
Chris?
Yeah, just very briefly to the question about whether there's kind of asymmetric polarization, whether one party is driving things more than the other. In terms of AI, I don't know of any evidence that it's leaning on one side. Of course, we all know Cambridge Analytica and that story, but I think there's a lot of other evidence that the left is using similar type of interventions. If we look at voting though. We do see strong evidence of asymmetric polarization over the last 30 years, conservatives taking increasingly conservative positions, whereas Democrats are only moving slightly to the left. So it's hard to say exactly.
Adrian?
All right, so that was mostly about AI stuff. But I also have a lot of research on mind perception, which I like to call mind attribution. So I think it was Descartes. Like, the only mind that I actually know exists is mine. And so when I'm looking at all of you and assuming you have minds, I'm creating that out of something. It turns out people really are aggressive when it comes to mind attribution. We see minds in everything. We see faces in the clouds, right? And I think my dog has a mind that is very, clever, and probably that's just me putting it on there. And so thinking in the same ways about sort of how technology is influencing our cognitive abilities, we can also think about this with social relationships, how we relate to others, and how a lot of people are hungry for social connection. So I kind of want to throw it back to this point, which was meant to be provocative about what we value. So there are social values, but there are also internal needs that we might value. And for example, in Japan, there's a large aging population that has nobody to spend time with them. And they're a lot more accepting of robots in Japan, and you have caretaker robots that are being developed, which provides some sort of a social relationship for somebody that would have nothing otherwise. And so I think that's interesting, seeing that maybe at this individual level, this is providing something of value. There's a very real human value. But then if you scale that out and say, do we want our relationships to be with robots because they're easier than relationships with people, then maybe we get afraid of it, right? And so thinking about how these values will scale out at the individual level, at the societal level, and then beyond human society, environmental issues, right, and where we fit into this larger sphere. That's it.
Thank you. Jeannette?
Let me take your question about anger and relating with robots and so on, and your response one level further, because one thing that I thought Adrian would speak about is how over time, when there is this new device or new technology, we actually learn how to interact with it. And so it could very well be that once we learn that the car is going to tell us or try to calm us down in some way, whether it's music or talking to us, we will know, oh, it's just the car saying that. I mean, we won't say it that way. We'll say it in a very angry manner because we're probably in an angry state. But that it's just like, my guess is that we learn how to interact with individuals on an individual basis. That's, I guess, emotional intelligence. And we will probably similarly learn how to interact with our self-driving cars or our semi-self-driving cars, as we will with our robots in our homes. And then you were talking about values, like in Japan, people are more accepting of robots, and there are more robots helping care for the elderly and the chronically ill. That's a cultural difference. And so we wouldn't want to take that away from the Japanese, who are perhaps more accepting than we are right now in America. So we have to be sensitive to those different value systems. And in terms of, I thought your question about the political extremes was, is AI going to be used by politicians to more effectively reinforce their own platforms and influence voters? And the answer is very likely. I mean, I'm actually surprised you didn't say that's happening already.
Well, I just want to thank this extraordinary panel for this discussion, kicking us off this morning at a very high level. I am optimistic about the future on the basis of, I actually have a reason. I have an empirical reason for being optimistic, which is the interest in this day today in the discussion about these issues, and the extraordinary intelligence of this panel in taking on very complex issues that we all worry and are concerned about. The fact that that is happening is something to be optimistic about. So thank you all very much. going to convene for 5 minutes and then come right back into the room, I know. And I know we're running a little late, but we started a little late.
Okay, so real quick, first of all, good morning. I hope everybody's suitably depressed, except for Esther. As the next panel makes its way up here, we're going to have a special multimedia presentation.